Good morning and welcome to the Trinity Forum. My name is BJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the forum Dr. Luke Bretherton. Dr. Bretherton is a professor of theological ethics at Duke University. His most recent book is Christ and the Common Life, Political Theology and the Case for Democracy. And we're going to talk about politics, and we're going to talk about ethics and human flourishing and what our call as the church is to speak about faithful witness. But I'm really excited about this conversation. And Luke, I want to welcome you to Cleveland by way of Durham, North Carolina. Trust me when I say it's a little colder here than it is there, but not too much, I think.
Only just warmed up.
I think so. I first met Dr. Bretherton at a conference in North Carolina, and you came and you spoke to us. These were the clergy of the Diocese of North Carolina. This is 2016, and we spoke about politics, which at the time we thought was volatile, and we as clergy and we as the people, as the church folk, didn't quite know how do we talk about this. And you spoke to us about what does it mean? Is politics a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Do we stay away from it? What is it? What does that mean? And I remembered that so vividly that as we were planning these forums, I got in touch with you in late summer because we were getting into the tail end of what we knew would be a volatile and crazy election cycle. And I thought, what a great conversation to have about the church. And it didn't work out to have you here until now. But my goodness, so much has happened. And as I have reread some of your essays that I wanted to talk about, I cannot get out of my mind what has happened in the United States in the last month. Right. And how we have suddenly been asking questions about what do we value? What are our common virtues? What is democracy, and what are we willing to fight for? What are we willing to commit to nonviolence for? So I am so grateful to have you here to join us in talking about this. So welcome.
It's an honor and a delight to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation and the opportunity.
So Luke, I want to start with politics. Uh-huh. Are they good or bad? Should we be talking about politics?
Well, I think politics is unavoidable, not in the kind of negative sense, but that as Christians, we make a claim about us being creatures. And as creatures, we're inherently mutually vulnerable creatures. We can't survive, let alone thrive, without others. Obviously, right from birth onwards, and that goes on throughout our life. And so, we're always in a situation where we're having to navigate and cultivate some kind of shared life with others. And the name we give for that is politics, I would suggest. And we tend to think about politics in this way in which we associate it with the state, with party politics, with what we read in the headlines and watch on kind of CNN or Fox News or whatever. And I think that's one kind of politics. I tend to call that statecraft. It's the kind of realm through which, at a kind of larger scale, through structures, systems, laws, we do this work of cultivating a shared life. But there's the more everyday realm of politics. And here we can go back to a kind of older tradition. I might call it a kind of Aristotelian tradition. And that sense that if I'm going to encounter someone who's different from me, or who I disagree with, or who I don't like, there's really only four options. I can either kill them, story of Cain and Abel, that wasn't a good outcome. Church has been doing that a lot over the centuries. I can coerce them. Again, we have long, terrible histories of that. I can act in such a way that I cause them to flee. And obviously there are many instances of that. And we might find ourselves on the wrong side of something and feel that's the only way forward. And there are many refugees around the world. Or we can do politics. We can navigate and cultivate some kind of common life amid asymmetries of power and rival or different or conflicting visions of the good. And so I don't think we can really escape politics. And if I have a noise dispute down the road and, I don't call the police, I'm not calling in statecraft to solve the problem. I have enough trust and relationship with the people making noise down the road. that we can sort it out. That's a form of politics. It's an informal kind of politics, but it's politics. You priests and clergy and the parish council in a church deciding whether to keep the pews in or take the pews out. Very contested, vehement, lots of passion.
I don't know.
I'm sure it's all peace
about.
and calm in Cleveland, but elsewhere
That's
in the
right.
world, these are very fervent matters. And and so there's different visions of what the good of the church is. There's a community of relations. There's asymmetries of power. Clergy have one kind of power. PCC have different kind of power. And so there's going to be navigation. And again, we have long histories of we tend to call fleeing schism. We create systems of coercion. We have religious wars. So there's ways in which this operates in the church as well. So I don't think we can ever escape politics in that kind of existential way. It's just part and parcel of how we do life to survive and thrive. Then the kind of second bit to your question, in some ways embedded in it, is this sense of, can Christians talk about politics? What's the relationship between Christianity and politics? And there, I think, again, we can't really think about God or talk of God apart from talk of politics. Think of our very language is suffused. The language of the New Testament is made up of New Testament, of political terms. Sovereignty, you could talk about God's sovereignty. The word for liturgy, liturgia, comes from the work of the people. It's a political term of public service. The word ecclesia was the which we get church from, is the gathering of the people of the city to deliberate on shared matters of shared concern. So we could replicate this across the words we use to talk about God, words we use to talk about what it means to be church, are inherently political terms. So there's that sense in which our very ways we imagine and narrate God are political. And then the ways, I would suggest also, the ways we imagine and narrate politics are theological. We're all the time borrowing terms from each other. We have political revelations, we have someone needs to repent, or this kind of goes on the whole time. So there's that sense. And I think then there's also the sense, I think, of the church is a politics. Then it's a way of cultivating a shared common life in the midst of the world that's supposed to bear witness to God's politics, to God's kingdom, to God's shalom, to the beloved community, to borrow Martin Luther King's terms. So I think there's an intrinsic way in being church and talking of God is to be caught up in a particular way of understanding and inhabiting a political life. And then I think at the intersection between what it means to be church and other ways of, forms of life in the world, there's ways in which we learn important things through engaging in politics: patience, courage, repentance. Anytime the church thinks it can close itself off from a broader cultivation of a common life with its neighbors, it either thinks it can kind of get hold of and grab too much power, and we see that with notions of like Christian nationalism. We've got the church has got to rule over everyone else, or there's a sense in which we become a kind of enclave. It's like a little cult, closed off from everyone, and that then becomes a often quite oppressive politics internal to the church community. And so there's something important here about this interaction between how the church is navigating and negotiating a shared life with those considered not church, to how we are faithful disciples, faithful witnesses in the world.
Mm-hmm. And you use a word, you said shared life. You often use the word common life as well.
Yeah.
And that word, our liturgy comes from the book of Common Prayer. Mm-hmm. That's a very bold word. Here at Trinity, we have something called the Trinity Commons. I know many cathedrals do, which when you really start looking at the deeper meaning of that, mm-hmm. it means it's something beyond the polis and the civic life. Rather, the common life means we've got to work it out together, and we've got to do it in view of God. And we're doing that with people who don't believe in God. We're doing with that who practice faith very differently. We do that with people who practice the Episcopal Church very differently, right? Mm-hmm. This is how the commons can be a very messy place, but it's also a really beautiful thing to hold us as we step into these questions. And a question so many questions come up for me, but I've certainly experienced as a preacher this idea that one does not speak of politics because it transgresses taboos.
Right.
But that, of course, is not. Politics is so personal that it's almost as if it is a shade over. Don't talk about politics because I don't want you to touch something that is personal to me, an almost religious devotion to a partisan approach, that the very conversation, the very language of that veers us away from, I think, some of the language that you use about human flourishing, about mutual vulnerability, almost the second thing you said, a politics of mutual vulnerability. I'd love to vote for that candidate. What is the unique limitation of our American understanding of politics here? And does the church, excuse me, I mean in the church, do we have a particular view on keeping the church and the world of the political distinct? And is that kind of rooted in our limited language of God and the civic life?
So to answer that, I think going back to what you're saying about the commons, which I think is an incredibly rich notion and very key to kind of recover in the contemporary moment. And some people talk about commoning, and we think about the commons in whether it's the Boston Common or the Cathedral Commons, or in England, where I come from, the commons were these shared space. It wasn't private property. It demanded this kind of negotiation, but it was you could forage, and the fish of the sea were a commons. Places you could go to generate your means of survival and kind of food, on which everyone depended. And they, as you say, they pre-exist formal political structures. And in many ways, our economies and our political structures are dependent on the commons, things like the language, commons through practices of shared life. Or we can treat the commons as purely extractive, and we don't tend them, right, and therefore we destroy them. And in doing so, we destroy our ability to have a shared life together. And so I think this sense of a view of a shared life, a common life that pre-exists, and on which that sense of interdependency is already there, and which other things are dependent on. And so when we come to think about church and politics, and don't talk about politics from the pulpit, what we're tending to do is confuse politics as statecraft, and then this particular legal separation of church and state, from the history of that in America. And we think that's all that politics is about, and somehow my political beliefs are my personal kind of possession, and it's somehow taboo to preach on that because you're mixing up spiritual things and worldly things, or all sorts of sacred and profane, and all sorts of categories we apply at that point. And we ignore how, when we're talking politics, we're talking about both the material, social, relational practices and world on which we all depend to survive, let alone thrive. And so what does it mean to, irrespective of our, the news channel we watch or the party we support, what does it mean to cultivate? What is a good childhood? And that's a common good. It doesn't just happen automatically. We have to think, reflect on, what does it mean to have a flourishing childhood in this place with these people in Cleveland at this time? And that, takes close attention to kind of what's happening, and the need for parks and cleaner air, and how we get to that, whether it's via the market or via the state, that's a secondary question. And that's what people tend to get caught up, to use a churchy term, ida fora, on secondary matters, which are party, political, ideological ways and means of getting to those things. But the basic vision of what is a good childhood, should we have clean water here? This is the commons on which we all depend, and we should be able to talk about. The church really should be talking about those kinds of things. And then we can have debates about the means and mechanisms and our particular ideological shibboleths for getting there. But that's a different kind of conversation and a bit more downstream from these more basic conditions of life kind of questions. And so I think there is both an American story to tell about church-state separation, which shapes how we think about this, and how we imagine that, which is caught up in a kind of state-centric vision of politics. But then there's also, I think, a modern, kind of bigger modern story that comes out of, that particular church-state story comes out of, which is religion is private, it's not public. Religion is what consenting adults do behind closed doors in private, and shouldn't really be, it's kind of naughty to talk about it elsewhere.
Right.
And I think that kind of view, which fits in a secularization story, that somehow to be modern is to be religious is incompatible with being modern, and to be religious in the modern world is a purely private thing. That's a very powerful narrative of the kind of modern world. We can trace it back to the 18th century onwards. And I think that's a wrong story. It's a false story. It's certainly not a true story. As one commentator puts it, the world is as furiously religious as ever. And we've, seen the role of religion in politics in the contemporary moment very powerfully and very problematically played out. But I think that's another aspect of this separation. And that isn't just an American issue. That's a much broader kind of Atlantic world issue. When
I think about the events of the last few weeks, especially the attack on the Capitol, that puts a certain urgency on what we're talking about. One, when I talk about the grief of what I'm experiencing, there is a sense of, you talk about shared virtues, and that one of the things the church can help cultivate those shared virtues, but those shared virtues in a sense is the commons, right. That there is a sense of, we all agree that a childhood ought to have certain qualities about them. And I want to be careful I'm not drawing a line here between sides of the aisle in a political establishment, but I will say that what we saw on the Capitol riots, to me, speaks of there is a schism between virtues here, in terms of there might be there are places where I'm afraid there's less commonality than I want there to be. Right. And I wonder how you experienced that as someone who has been studying this stuff very, very carefully. Were you not surprised? Were you surprised? Does that fit into something? I'm sure you've been thinking about this all along, but how did you respond, given your body of work, given what drives you to tie our relationship with God, to our relationship to our neighbor, to how we build the commons together?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think so. There's this curious emotion that I think many of us have lived through the past 4 years or so, where you're both not surprised and shocked. And I don't really have a name for that emotion, but that's, I seem to have gone through various permutations of that emotion, which is totally unsurprised and yet still completely shocked. So yeah, that was my effective response. I think I've been, it's kind of, but have been talking about for a while this question. It goes back to the commons issue. Politics depends on social trust. Economics depends on social trust. One of the problems with how we imagine the world of politics and the world of economics and banking, and we tend to think there's a kind of hard world of spreadsheets and then party politics and campaigns, and this is the hard world. And then there's this soft, mushy stuff called trust and faith and hope, and that's kind of wishy-washy stuff. And I think that's completely the wrong way round. The really hard reality, the tough reality we have to face is the breakdown of social trust is the breakdown of everything else. So in the economic realm, we lose trust in the bank, we lose faith in the bank. There's a run on the bank, the economy collapses. That's what we went through in 2008 and 2007. What we're living through now is a breakdown in trust in the political system. and there's the equivalent of run on the bank. The whole thing begins to break down. And so these incredibly precious, fragile, nurtured things called the rule of law and this crazy paradoxical notion, the loyal opposition, that these are things which democracy depends on, our politics depend on, all, whether it's Apple computers and General Motors and the generals in their bunkers, all of that collapses and disappears without something called social trust. It doesn't exist anymore. So when social trust breaks down and you lose that notion that I don't have to take to the hills with my AR-15 or AK-47 if I lose the election, and because I trust that those in power won't come after me. And what we saw in the Capitol insurrection was the in a sense, at one level, the death knell of the notion of the loyal opposition in a large section of the population, stoked by the president. And we can we could analyze where that comes from and who's to blame, but the kind of sheer fact of we've got a major loss of faith, of social trust, which generates the breakdown in the notion of the loyal opposition, and likewise the rule of law. You can't legislate the rule of law. You can't enforce the rule, as we see in Myanmar today. You can have a junta and dictatorship, but the rule of law doesn't come from the end of the gun. It's a creation of social trust that everyone is subject to the law. And again, that has been put under severe strain. So I think the reweaving of a social fabric through which people can actually learn to trust. We might put this in very Christian terms of re-neighboring each other, so that we can see each other as neighbors and not as enemies. It's a basic call of a stipulation of neighbor love, that it is love your enemies. And and I'm not drawing a moral equivalence here, but I think that sense of the breakdown of social trust spans the ideological spectrum, whether of left or right. There is a breakdown of trust and each treats the other as a kind of culturally repugnant other who is an enemy to their way of life. And I think that makes some notion of politics as the negotiation of common life extremely tenuous, and we're teeter on the edge of civil conflict in one form or another. So I think there is a lot of stake. I think that I've been worrying about exactly that problem for a couple of years now, and so the Capitol insurrection was exactly a kind of coming to fruition of something I have been very concerned about for a long time. But then the flip side of that is, do we take the position that there really is nothing in common? Do we think that we're locked in an irreconcilable conflict and polarization is the only way forward? I don't think that's a true story either. I think that's a story MSNBC and Fox News want to tell us because they make money off us thinking that. Facebook makes a lot of money of us behaving like that. So polarization suits certain people, but it actually, when it comes down to it, as we see in Texas through the recent storms, as I experience here in North Carolina every time with this weird meteorological phenomenon of freezing rain, and we all have to kind of work out.
Which is so much worse than anything we get in Cleveland. I just want to be on record as saying,
I genuinely think
this the Cleveland snow over the freezing
exactly.
rain.
I'm like, why can't we have snow? It's the worst meteorological phenomenon.
It's the deadliest thing. It's like not since frogs coming from the heavens. They're the match.
You feel my pain. It's so
yes.
So this kind of weird. You have freezing rain. Of course, the power goes out. We all have to, we in my cul-de-sac, we have a gas oven, so we can kind of cook food. And it doesn't matter the ideological differences of my neighbors, and we vote differently. That there's a sense of either we're going to work it out, and he has a set of tools that I need to sort things out. There's a way in which there's an inherent interdependency that is deeper and more basic. Going back to what I said at the very outset, we're mutually vulnerable creatures. We can't survive, let alone thrive, without others. And that's just a fact, a hard fact.
Right.
And people want to make money of us to live in denial of that fact. and get us to believe that's not a true fact of life. But it remains for us to kind of puncture that and say no. So for instance, a very good example, Wisconsin, there's amazing work, organizing work, looking internet access and getting, very loyal Trump supporters and progressive types together to fight against the cable company who wasn't supplying decent internet access in rural areas, because there's a mutual recognition. Everyone needs, whatever your political views, you all need decent internet access in this day and age, particularly when your kids are dependent on it for schooling. And so that was that shared good they were able to discover and come together around a real material need. And actually suddenly realizing the ideological differences were secondary to that actual meaningful mutual vulnerability and shared interdependency. So I think if we can take the time to unhook ourselves from the kind of technologies of distraction and their narratives of polarization, and actually take the time to listen to people different from ourselves and hear their story and not treat them as a bundle of ideological commitments, but actually realize we're all kind of complex people with kind of weird commitments and some rather sane commitments and some that are a bit batty. We can probably find areas in which we do have kind of shared need and which we can come together. Doesn't mean I have to like you or get along with you, but it does mean there's a common life that can be discovered here together.
And there's something very local about what you just described. When I think about what MSNBC and Fox News and whatever Facebook is telling me about the world, I don't feel a whole lot of hope, because I feel like that there is a narrative that I cannot penetrate, and it's consuming and contorting the stories of everybody I know. But looking local, I find it more hopeful, because you can actually see where those shared vulnerabilities are in action. It's really hard not to see your neighbor when you're looking right at them. I think we also have work to do around not organizing ourselves in completely like-minded enclaves so that we no longer hear our neighbor. But there's also, to me, great hope in a politics that is more incarnate, more local, more neighbored. And that's where I feel like you also talk about the word craft, not statecraft, but craft. And we have a member here who is on the city council of one of our inner ring suburbs, and is a great example of the craft of politics. Meaning, for a year, she got not only is she well known in that community, but she went to everything. She knocked on every door, and there's craft in that. And what's the difference between politics as craft versus politics as statecraft in your words?
Right. Yeah. So I think there is a craft to state. Good bureaucrat is a craft. Being a good bureaucrat is a kind of craft. Good politician is learning a craft. So I think I don't want to draw a separation between them, but I think if we think about a craft we learn through time. It takes a particular quality and character of relationships. It demands we're deeply attentive to the world as it is, and its kind of material realities. So think about fishing, carpentry. I have to pay attention to this kind of wood and its grain and its suppleness and what I can do with it on the lathe or working it. I have to pay attention to this river, these fish, what kind of tools do I need to do this kind of work? And so craft is also, it demands this attention. It demands a particular quality and character of relationship to the world around you. And it crucially involves action in time. So it involves questions about when, how, who, where to act. So think about the catching of the fish. It's if you're going to do it, it's doing it this time and acting now. You might catch it, 10 minutes later, you probably won't. And there's a kind of deep connection between how you act and the material social reality of the world you're trying to act in. And politics as a craft I would contrast not necessarily with statecraft, which I think can demand similar kind of orientations, but politics as a procedure or as a set of ideas or ideologies. And so we think we can just get the procedure right. And often in churches, we do this, in institutions like universities and schools, we do this, that somehow we don't need to pay attention to the quality and character of relationship and cultivating those. We don't need to pay attention to how we should act, when, where, with whom, and what that should involve. We just think we get the procedure right and everyone follows the procedure. It's a kind of a legalistic way of proceeding,
Right.
which actually then subverts the actual quality and character of relationships to a heavy-handed proceduralism. And we're all, moan about health and safety legislation, but that's a good example.
Right.
In London, and there's a kid got stuck up a tree, and the teachers, because of the health and safety regulations, wouldn't kind of get the kid. And so there's a passerby walking by, and this is ridiculous. So he went and got a ladder and he climbed up the tree, got the kid down, and then the school prosecuted him for trespass and that he shouldn't have been in the school. And it's like that is a kind of a madness there, where you see where these procedures were trying to help, but at a certain point, the social relationships are made to serve the procedure, not the procedure made to serve the social relationship. And of course, Jesus had a good story about this. Does man serve the Sabbath, or the Sabbath serve man? And so there's this sense in which procedural, confusing politics as craft with politics as procedure is deeply destructive. And we rightly complain about kind of bureaucratic impositions. But then, of course, there's politics as reduced to a set of ideas. Somehow, if I have beautiful ideas, or I just get my ideology correct, and then I can kind of use some social engineering program to force everyone conform to this idea. And that goes out very ancient history. We think about Plato. The best ruler is the philosopher king. And the philosopher has the ideal form, and then you make material social reality conform to that idea. And ideological
nice work if you can get it, right?
Nice work if you can get it. And of course, it's always deeply destructive. And the history of the 20th century is littered with, human carnage of people using social engineering programs to kind of try and engineer the utopian future that they wanted to enact. And so I think that's very different from the more Aristotelian sense of the ideal ruler is not the philosopher king, but the ship's captain, who has to pay attention to the wind and the rain and who are the crew and what can they cope with and how far can you go from the shore and where are we trying to get to? And therefore, what are the kind of judgments I've got to make? And they're constantly changing in the face of the mercurial sea. And so this sense of this action in time, constantly adjusting, who are these people? What can we do together? That kind of close attention is a very different orientation than I think the dominant modes we're schooled to imagine politics in, which is this politics as procedure in a kind of juridical, sense, or politics as ideas and ideology.
Well, and that metaphor of the ship really that speaks to me of the local urgency that in no way diminishes the importance of leadership.
Right.
If we're on that ship together and the storm is coming, you can feel however you want about, do you believe in storms or not, but they're coming. You're going to have to do something about it.
Yeah.
And preferably you're going to work together and you're going to trust each other, and hopefully you trust your captain and you'll get out of it. Mm-hmm. Maybe. But the farther we get from that incarnate, the more up the chain we get, the more abstracted we become, and the more we begin to see each other through these abstractions. Yeah. And it seems that that seems to be one of the hardwired ways that our own culture, society, country makes ourselves vulnerable and fragile.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think, the scriptural language for this is idolatry. When we actually value a thing, a wooden statue or a piece of gold or whatever it is, or we can say an idea, we're immediately in that mode of abstraction, and we're valuing a thing rather than persons and people and their relationships and the forms of life through which they kind of nourish and nurture each other. And so I think that we are the politics of craft that demands actually paying attention to who are these people in this place at this time is an anti-idolatry measure. And that should be for a faith that proclaims the word made flesh, and that the truth is inhabited. It's not about an idea. It's not just a kind of set of statement of faith. The metric of are you living truthfully is the quality and character of your love of God and neighbor. And so if the word is to become flesh amongst us, and we're to inhabit truthfulness, then we should, as the church, be a people who are deeply attentive to the material realities and social life of the people around us. And I think that that endless move, and in some ways is the kind of primal heresy of the church, of Gnosticism, where we think actually what it means to worship God is somehow to rise above the material, to rise above the actual social realities and escape them, rather than the follow the Christ who says to those on the road to Emmaus, go back to Jerusalem. Their hearts strangely lifted, and they went back into the very center and heart of the political economy, and live differently amidst that, through that encounter with Christ. And that sense of inhabiting the truth here and now, and through deep attention, through a craft-like attention, so that it can reweave the social fabric, reweave the economic fabric, reweave the political fabric, so it bears witness to a more just and generous form of life that speaks to the kingdom of God. That, I think, should be the animating vision of the church. And too often we're so caught up in forms of idolatry and enchanted by these, and how they distract us and call us away from paying attention to actually who we're living with, that we don't, we're just kind of drawn, our heads are turned to look the wrong way.
Right. And if I could bring in today's gospel passage to further confuse us, where Jesus says to Peter, after he rebukes Jesus, you're setting your mind on human things rather than on God, on the life of God. One could make the mistake of saying, I ought not worry about the human being who is next to me, and rather I'm gonna become the philosopher king or philosopher pope or what, and separate myself out from the world. But not only are we being called to honor the spiritual life, that includes a profound commitment to the people who are on this ship with us, to these people who are actually in our community, and that craft, I think, in the word that you use it is itself a kind of holy thing, because it's a way that we build relationships, honor the dignity in each one and the presence of God as well, and even create the very possibility of the common life.
Yeah, because we cannot hear God's address outside of God's creation and the people God calls us to love as neighbors. That's the love of God and love of neighbor are always intertwined and kind of mutually constitutive. That to say I love God without loving my neighbor, but it goes beyond that. To say I can even hear the call of God and understand who God is outside of love of neighbor. But likewise, the reverse works as well, to understand what it means to love a neighbor outside of being attentive to God in craft-like ways, through spiritual practices, through prayer, through worship, and the kind of deep modes of attention this trains us in. These have to go together. And so there's not an opposition between spirituality and politics. Rather, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, is the one who brings creation to being, who hovers over Mary and enables the Christ to be incarnate. It's the Spirit who enables true materiality. And so a deep spirituality and a deep attention to the kind of craft-like form of politics actually feed each other, because both are ways of paying attention to this creation through whom God is addressing us and calling us in to being as persons in relations with others.
Luke, I want to close with one question. What are you most hopeful about?
So I think there are this the kind of craft-like forms of politics, and the sense that outside of obviously the huge kind of problems we face, whether it's structural racism, whether it's climate kind of issues of anthropogenic climate change, the creativity and attention to kind of people in particular places, and the ways in which people are coming together to find creative solutions to shared problems, and discovering their agency and discovering their own sense of who they are through that shared work, good shared work together. I think that is very exciting and gives me hope. And then beyond that, I think it's not just hope. We actually, it's the faith. It's the faith that I'm not determined. You know, what is the virtue of faith? The virtue of faith is that I trust that God is the last word, not the world's it is. I trust that God is acting through Christ and the Spirit here amongst us now, and that we can discover how God is acting amongst us, and that the world as it is, in all its carnage and horror, doesn't determine reality, is not the omega, is not the final word, and that there's a larger reality and a deeper love, a deeper reality that is shaping things, and that I think is taking the time to be still, to be attuned to that, and to see through these modes of creative coming together to address shared problems of real issues. I think that is very exciting and does give me both hope and confirms of my faith. And I think it's a lovely example. I'm at Greater Cleveland, the community organizing kind of coalition in Cleveland does great work along similar lines around exactly as a kind of model of this in many ways, I would say.
Well, it's been an important part of our life here at Trinity as well.
Right.
Well, that does something for me that your work does as well, which it really gives me hope. And I was so grateful for what you've written, because it has helped me to get out of the dark. We get into this place where we spin our wheels around our culture's definitions of politics, which are not productive and are not and insulate us from the holiness of being able to be in meaningful conversation with neighbors to figure out how to make life more fruitful for everybody. And there's great hope in that. And so I'm really grateful for you and for your work and for how it's helped me in my own. So
thank you.
Luke, thank you for being here. And I do thank you for joining us from icy Durham, North Carolina. But I do hope you'll visit us here in Cleveland so that we can continue the conversation in person. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
A word of thanks to Dr. Luke Bretherton for joining us. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Continue to send questions my way, and as we continue the conversation of what it means to bear witness, what it means to work for human flourishing, what it means to find hope and the presence of God in the midst of all of this. Thanks so much for watching.